In the mental health field, too often, we've made it seem as if it's just in your head. Just in your head.
The landlord can hijack the rent by 20%. That impacts people's mental health.
Can't have a profit-driven mental health care system if we want our people to be connected and healthy.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to It's Not Just in Your Head. I'm Max Golding, LMFT. We've got Harriet. Who are you?
Here I am. I'm Harriet Fraud, mental health counselor, or you want to call me by title, Dr. Harriet Fraud, hypnotherapist, mental health counselor, radical activist, and co-partner on this wonderful podcast.
So before we start, we actually forgot to do this, I think, the last two episodes in the beginning. So just a quick shout out to our patrons First Winter, Sarah Turner, Rebecca Johns, Justin Harper, and Bandila Msimanga. And of course, Liam for all the help with editing and social media. So today we're going to be talking with somebody I'm really excited to hear from. Her name is Jennifer White, and she's one of the founders of the Critical Suicidology Network. It's a growing international network of scholars interested in exploring alternatives to biomedical approaches to suicide prevention. And Critical Suicidology brings together people with lived experience, mental health professionals, researchers, and activists to rethink what it means to study suicide and enact practices of suicide prevention. By the way, I'm reading from a Mad in America article, which we'll link. They have such a beautiful intro leading up to her. So also she's a professor in the School of Child and Youth Care at the University of Victoria in British Columbia, Canada. And she's practiced as a counselor, educator, researcher, and advocate, and has served 7 years as the director of the Suicide Prevention Center in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. So all kinds of other things we could say about her, but we'll just get into it more, just like hear from what she actually has to say. But it's exciting for us. I mean, for me, I've worked with a fair amount of, suicidal people. And so I really personally enjoy this topic. But just our first question, because like in that first lead up, one of the founders of the Critical Suicidology Network, like, what is critical suicidology, Jennifer? What does that phrase mean?
Thanks, Max, for that question. And thank you, both of you, for having me this morning. And I think that's a great place to begin. And one of the things I can say about critical suicidology or critical suicide studies is it attempts to rethink what we think we know about what suicide is. And I think part of the critique of the dominant approach to suicidology and suicide prevention is that it tends to frame suicide in a very narrow psychological framework that equates or conflates suicide with mental illness. And so I think the number of scholars that have been drawn to the Critical Suicide Studies Network and practitioners, and as you say, those with lived experience, are interested in broadening how we think about it in ways that contextualize distress, that don't just locate problems in persons, but recognizes suicide as a response often to injustice, exclusion, hate, oppression, and all of the other kinds of forms of violence that many people experience.
Wow. Okay. So it's a really expansive. It kind of, the theme of our podcast, It's Not Just in Your Head, is we're trying to get that impression across that that the sort of medical and symptom-based model of just looking at quote unquote mental illness is just generally insufficient because there's so much more going on in the world and in people's lives. So it sounds like critical suicidology is trying to apply that kind of concept to just the phenomenon of suicidology, suicidal ideation, suicidal completions and acts. Is that right?
Absolutely. And I think there's a lot of resonance with the kinds of things that you've been exploring on your podcast. And so this individualizing, pathologizing, medicalizing way of thinking about suicide is something that we've inherited, but it's not required, it's not natural, or it's not inevitable. And I think what we want to show is that there are other ways of framing suicide, that invites other ways of responding. And just by way to show the instability of the meaning of suicide throughout throughout history, it's meant many different things. There's been times in history where it's been viewed as a sin. There's been times in history where it's been viewed as a crime. There's been times in places throughout the world where it was considered honorable to die by suicide under certain conditions. And we're in this era now where we've taken it for granted that it's an illness, and we frame it as a mental health problem. And so just opening up that space to show, well, no, that isn't necessarily inherent to the act of suicide to call it an illness, that there's other ways of thinking about it. And that then creates possibilities for a diverse set of responses, I think.
Yeah, I think it's very important, because part of what's happened in the medical field and in the psychology fields is an evasion of political responsibility by trying to pinpoint people's upsets as biological, chemical imbalances or something else completely apart from the social network in which they are woven. And one of the things this show is trying to do is recontextualize psychology with the rest of life that people endure. And your studies are another wonderful example of doing so. So I'm really glad you're doing it.
Yeah, and I think a lot of the work here in Canada, and I should say I'm located here on the traditional unceded territory of the Lekwungen people. And so making visible my status as a settler, a European settler to these lands that has displaced Indigenous people is an important acknowledgement, because many Indigenous people in Canada have disproportionately high rates of suicide relative to the general population. And I think this provides a good example to show the effects of colonization and the violence that's been done to displace Indigenous people, to disconnect them from their cultural teachings. Sometimes their children were apprehended, and tremendous kind of disavowal of Indigenous sovereignty. And so these are some of the ways that I've been working with my Indigenous colleagues here in Canada to make those things visible when framing distress, and the possibility for responding in a different way also requires a political response that engages with social injustice.
Yeah, it's like the work of Paulo Freire in education and others who say this is a response in part to disempowerment. And that's so of Native Americans, the dispossessed, and African Americans, as Fanon talks about, that there is psychological damage, which is not some kind of isolated medical development, but a result of battery in the colonial frame.
Exactly. And that's why contextualizing distress and seeing suicide as a response as opposed to a symptom or a pathology is an important move to make. And I think that the engagement of folks who want to see a different world that's possible for all of us to flourish and have access to equitable resources is a way of thinking about suicide prevention that's quite different from a risk assessment or a narrow treatment approach. But I always like to say in these opportunities is that we're not saying let's not have treatment opportunities or let's not make sure high quality mental health care is available for people. That's important. But as you said at the beginning, Max, it's just insufficient on its own.
But
go ahead, Max.
Just I'm curious, how did you get interested? It seems like you've spent a lot, at least a decade or something, I don't know, a while on this. Like, how did you get interested in this work? Suicidology specifically, and then how did you shift from, however that's been framed in the mainstream psychology world into this more critical framework?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I sometimes have to think about where I begin the story, because I remember working as a very young, naive, inexperienced child and youth care practitioner when I began my career, where we were working in a residential facility for children who had multiple traumas and multiple co-occurring mental health disorders. And there was a suicide in the institutional setting where I worked. And I remember that the fallout from that was there was all these procedures procedures that were instituted that had to do with making sure that, students, or not students, but the young people we were working with didn't have access to belts or things that they could hang themselves with. And there was a lot of paperwork that was required about doing constant checks. And so the move was very much procedural. And I didn't think about it at the time. And I kind of went away in my career and then learned more about how to do suicide risk assessments and the kinds of questions to ask and the importance of figuring out whether people were at low, moderate, or high risk and tailoring the treatments to map onto these things. So I was kind of carrying on both as a counselor and as a researcher, working with those very mainstream ideas, but then became kind of disenchanted with them because of the ways in which they obscured these political relationships. They obscured the ethics of the work. They tended to individualize people's problems. And then I learned that there were other scholars, Ian Marsh being one of them. If you haven't read his book on suicide, he takes a Foucauldian analysis of suicide. That's a tremendous piece of work and an important contribution. And then there was more and more of us that started to show up at these kind of mainstream conferences to say, let's think about an alternative. Let's think what else might be possible, because what we've been doing clearly isn't working. So it was sort of a disenchantment with what we were doing, and then finding other theoretical resources, other ways of thinking about the work, other engagements with people's lived experience that helped me to think, there's a community of solidarity here that we can link to think about other possibilities for how we might respond.
That I'm really intrigued by this and by your idea of, particularly I'm involved in the United States, but how suicidality is developing in the thoughts of Americans, and how many more people are committing suicide, and wondering how they compare with their brothers and sisters in Canada or other developed countries, whether the U.S. suicide rate jumps with the disintegration of our social fabric.
Yeah, which is, of course, what Durkheim was kind of basing his whole sociological theory on, was studying suicide patterns. And I'm not a sociologist and I'm not an epidemiologist, but what I can say is that suicide rates certainly fluctuate over time, and that there are trend lines to pay attention to. And depending on what period of time you look at, we can see either an overall decline. So if you look back, say, from 1990 to the present, we might see an overall decline among many European and North American countries in terms of suicide rates. If you were to look back at the last 2 decades, for example, in the United States, there's been an increase over time. But in 2019, I just looked up this morning, according to the latest data from CDC, there has been a significant decrease between 2019 and 2018. So it does vary. And I think it's important to take a long view of these things and to not make judgments based on year-to-year fluctuations. But the one thing I would say that I do know to be true about suicides in the United States is the disproportionate number of people dying by suicide with firearms. And that's very profound when you compare that to other countries where the method of suicide makes a difference in terms of how many people die, because that's a very lethal method. And so that is one thing I think that's noteworthy about your particular context there. And I think the other thing is, we can't make sense of any one suicide by having singular theories or singular stories about what it means. And I think this is part of it. We do need to contextualize it and know it's a complex phenomenon that's affected by our individual histories, our individual psychology and neurobiology, our families, our cultural context, the societies that we live in. And the way we speak about suicide, I think, is very stigmatizing. And so it gets in the way of people even asking for help, because there's sometimes a sense of shame, or sometimes I think also people fear losing their autonomy or being put in hospital against their will. And these are some things that I think those with lived experience of suicide have really helped us to understand. is that there's concerns about the response, where there's a tremendous amount of surveillance, there's a tremendous amount of fear of being coerced into a treatment in a hospital that you don't want. And so I think we really need to broaden our view about whose knowledge we're going to mobilize when we think about the response as well. I think that's an important contribution from those with lived experience.
I think so too. And I do note that in the book, The Spirit Level by Wilkinson and Pickett, they note suicide as one of the markers of social inequality and pain. And I wondered if you see that as a marker as well.
Yes, and I think that this really links nicely to the social determinants of mental health, and that we know that when people don't have access to jobs or housing or secure employment, or that they, are not able to get access to the same resources as others, that we know that this has a negative impact and corrosive impact on people's health and well-being. And so this whole concept of deaths of despair and situating suicide in context of socioeconomic deprivation and economic hardship, I think these are things that we need to bring into the framework, as opposed to just thinking about it in psychological terms. So that's an important move I think we need to make.
I'm curious about in Canada, whether it's the same there as it is here, and that, there's been this huge shift in the last, few decades in this almost like an abandonment of, say, like psychoanalytic and client, Rogerian and all of the sort of the older styles of like psychotherapy and just approaches of mental health, and a shift toward more like cognitive behavioral. So I guess first, is it the same in Canada, or do you guys have more of like a diversity? And I guess second, how do you see the relationship to this a more behavioral and almost like mechanized sort of approach to addressing suicide generally? I mean, is it
well, I think
net positive, net negative?
Yeah, I think we do. We are acting under the same dominant influence of evidence-based practice that you would be there. And I think the kinds of therapeutic modalities that come out very strong, according to those kinds of systematic reviews, are DBT, dialectical behavior therapy, and cognitive behavior therapy. But I think, again, without a critique of what counts as evidence, or without a critique of saying, well, how are these studies demonstrating that these are superior, who's excluded from the studies, how's evidence being defined? It's a very narrow kind of way of thinking about it. And so right there, you start getting into the politics of evidence, which I think is important. And I think it's important to show that there's contestation about these things. And some of those therapies are very amenable to that kind of quantification and targets and measuring behaviors, and others are less so.
Well, and I, in my clinical training site for like 5 years, I had a lot of, I had like a weekly DBT supervision. I have a lot of experience with DBT. I'm not like officially certified. It's like really hard to get like officially certified. So I've been a big fan of it, but it is, I think of it more as like a principle based versus like a sort of manualized kind of treatment model. But it's in my understanding is when Marsha Linehan sort of developed it in the 80s, she was seeing that there was this shift toward a sort of behaviorist, like she says herself that she called it dialectical behavioral therapy because she knew that if she called it what she wanted to call it, which was going to have something that sounded more spiritual or like mindfulness based, that it wouldn't get attention. She couldn't sell books, and she couldn't really create a new modality. So she herself was sort of recognizing she had to sort of play the game of how the system wants to frame mental health in order to basically put mindfulness, because her whole thing is she wanted to basically just put like Zen Buddhism into mental health. But I mean, I guess so, because I've always thought of, and this is a little bit of a tangent, I guess, but just I've always thought of DBT since really getting to know it as Marsha Linehan, someone with a lot of lived experience, right? She had like really pervasive chronic suicidality problems, who tried to subversively almost like hijack the now sort of behaviorized, medicalized mental health system into creating a behaviorally permissible treatment. But even then, I guess all that said, as I have fondness of DBT and I'm also critical of it. It also is a very depoliticized framework, right? It doesn't look so much at the context. Even, biosocial theory looks at, pervasive invalidating environment, and then there's there's some biological components, but if you have an invalidating social environment, which could be sexism, racism, I don't know, colonialism, you could maybe frame it that way. But DBT never actually front loads any of that into the conversation. It is actually focusing on symptoms and everything. So I don't know. This is a little bit of a selfish rant because I like DBT, but I'm just curious from the critical suicidology perspective, do you have any thoughts on DBT in that general framework?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, I think that there's lots of evidence that it works for lots of folks. And so we would never want to say, well, if that's the therapy you're receiving and it's helping you in the ways that you're seeking help, then great. I think what we're saying is let's not make that the only available treatment for people. And so it's interesting what you're saying about Marsha Linehan's efforts were originally probably meant to be quite radical, to be disruptive.
Right.
And it also shows about the co-opting that goes on when we start manualizing things and saying it's standardized, everybody gets this. And I think the critique often of DBT or CBT is, again, it locates the problem in persons and that they become responsible for becoming better self-regulators, managing their emotions, tolerating distress, and again, obscuring from view all of these contextual features that we've been talking about, leaving them untouched. And so the example of a queer youth or a trans youth who's experiencing hostility, hate, bullying, and if they're being told these are strategies for, self-regulation and distress tolerance, while these other things remain untouched, that doesn't seem just, right? So it's that kind of thing of like who is being expected to accommodate, and Vicki Reynolds calls this, we don't want to be helping people to accommodate to lives of hell, right? By teaching them better coping strategies. There's something that needs to be resisted or disrupted in those oppressive forces. So I think that's an important kind of thing to be thinking about as well.
I do too. And I think it allows the client to understand that there's ways to fight back against the things that drive a person to suicide. That if you feel that your life isn't wanted by either your parents or the society at large, you can form a rebellion against those forces that cooperate in making you feel like you're not worth living. And so,
it doesn't require you to kill yourself to enact the rebellion.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. You can you can discover your own agency in stopping the problem, which CBT and DBT doesn't do. If you look at what is showing you that your life has no worth, and realize that it's not only your folks or whatever, it's racism or it's classism or whatever, you can become an agent of change rather than just a sufferer from the effects of being devalued. And that's a very important healer.
I agree with you, Harriet. And I think, too, I'm a big fan of narrative therapy that situates problems outside of people and enables people to take a stand against things that are not of their things that they're up against that are not of their own making. And so, again, it historicizes and contextualizes and asks questions about, what does it say about the world that we're living in, that this kind of experience is being less valued than another. And it helps people to see that they're not alone and isolated, but this is part of a broader historical and cultural way of thinking about problems and the way that it does get individualized.
How much do you think that legal liabilities get in the way of us conceptualizing and approaching suicide? Like, meaning, I guess to give, well, maybe for listeners that aren't aware, like, so if one of our clients if once we start to detect that there is some suicide risk, there's a sort of set of protocols that we're supposed to move toward to prevent them from committing suicide, which can in some cases mean like calling authorities or something. Or I don't know if the laws are the same in Canada or as here, but in the US at least, if we find out somebody has a plan or they're really close to a plan or whatever, we have to kind of start in our tracks and just zoom in on that and like you're not supposed to go existential. You're just supposed to make sure that they don't kill themselves. And I guess I'm not trying to say on air, like, I'm opposed to that. People should just kill themselves. But there's a liability piece where, like, this has never happened to me, and I don't think it happens all that often, but there is a sort of hovering, looming reality above all clinicians, which is that if somebody does actually kill themselves, and if their family or somebody decides that it's your fault because you didn't prevent it, they can sue you, and you could, like, lose your license, you could get fined or whatever. And because I think from a more existential, maybe kind of perspective, you could say, like, well, people are sort of allowed to kill themselves. Like, they might just kill themselves. And it's not like the fault of a clinician or whatever. But how much do you think that influences how we deal with this in the room and how we talk about it, since there's actually, like, legal consequences for not approaching it for us to not be like superheroes, I guess, for people, kind of?
Right. No, I think it's a huge issue, and I think it's very consequential in terms of the kind of care people receive. So, for example, I've just been doing a study with counselors here who are working in an outpatient mental health treatment setting with young people, and this very issue came up quite a bit about fear of being blamed, liability concerns. And as you say, Max, the minute suicide enters the conversation, it's almost as if all that relational work and effort to build a strong alliance kind of gets put to the side, and out comes the figurative risk assessment form. There's kind of tickable boxes. It's a tick box mentality that takes over, and the anxiety of the clinician is heightened, thinking I'm going to be blamed, or I'm responsible for keeping this person alive. And then all of the things that we know can be the most helpful kind of become compromised, because then now distance is introduced into the relationship. So some of those protocols and procedures can be experienced as quite dehumanizing. And they're also, we had a counselor, this was a qualitative study, she told a story where the client themselves saying, oh, do we have to go through that? Can't we just skip that part and go to the helpful part? They know, they've been primed. They've been on the receiving end of those same risk assessment questions often, many times. They could probably recite them from heart. And they're what I've called in other places kind of deadening conversations. They're not fresh. They don't open up possibility for thinking anew. They don't, there's no energy or movement in them. They're just a series of yes, no. And the clinicians themselves say, yes, they know that their paperwork has to be in order. There's this kind of hypervigilance. And so I think it's one of the things that I took away from this recent study was we're not saying that those things should be thrown out or that we don't have an obligation to adhere to the institutional requirements, but that there's another level of practice that can be going on alongside where people are, doing what's required for the standard of care, but also staying connected and staying close to the person's story, so that it isn't just an either or, but somehow what I've called like a doubled practice, that they can be happening together, so it doesn't get reduced to this procedural way of working.
Yeah, when I have a client, one of the things I tell them initially is that our communications are confidential, but if you have a specific plan to kill yourself, and you tell me about it, I'm required by law to report that, just so you know, and I'm candid with you. That would be the exception. And I never did have a client. I've been in practice 46 years. I never had a client kill him or her themselves. Never did. But suicidal ideation is actually part of a lot of normal people, where you just think, I can't take this anymore, I'm checking out. But it doesn't mean that you're specifically planning. It just means that you've had more than you can bear at that time. And there has to be some differentiation.
And when people encounter a listening presence that's curious and calm and wanting to know more and not like kind of hitting the hyperactive emergency button right away.
Yeah.
There's a possibility for the person to explore that. And we know that many people say the very thing that enabled me to go on living was knowing I had this suicide plan in my back pocket. Like it's this paradoxical thing. It says, don't take that away from me. Like, don't disallow me from having this thought, or say, you're not allowed to speak that way here because I'm going to then activate this emergency response.
And it really is up to us, because of a relationship we've established, to feel and know the intention of the client.
Yeah.
I mean, I once had a woman who every time her session was over, she'd say, I think I'll kill myself. And I'd say, well, we'll talk about it next week. Because I knew she was just saying that because she wanted me to continue to be engaged with her. But on paper, it was callous of me. In the context of our relationship, it really wasn't.
It's a good example.
Yeah. Well, I had a professor in therapist school who had once said that she believes that people have a right to kill themselves. That like it's a sort of autonomy thing, like that it's their life, like they can if they want to. And it always stood out to me because she was just I thought she was very bold in saying that. Like she was saying it, I think, also to be kind of disruptive, to say like, look, I know we have all these, I've been in practice forever and I know we have all these rules and stuff, but this is just my personal philosophy. And I really dwelled on that for a while. And then once I went into the clinic where I was at, working with, a fair amount, it wasn't like all my clients were suicidal, but like fair amount of like, cutting, parasuicidality and suicidal attempts and stuff and hospitalizations with a fair amount of teenagers, and actually found that the more real I was with them, like the ones that I can think of, like in the beginning, with, if they came in and I already knew from the intake, like there were attempts and stuff, that if I said something like, look, I don't actually, this is going to sound really weird maybe, but like, I don't really care necessarily whether or not you kill yourself. First of all, I don't really know you, so I'm not going to pretend like we're best friends and I like really care. So first of all, I'm not going to be fake like that, right? It's, you can kind of do what you want with your life. So me even saying this, I have like a fear as I'm verbalizing this on like a podcast that like somebody could say like, I'm going to go to your licensing board or something. But the thing is, I think in context, the reason I was kind of saying this, so I guess it's sort of strategic, but it's also relational, is to say that, again, it is your right, and then explaining, but but here's the legal piece, right? If this happens, then I have to like trigger this response and everything, and I have to start acting like a robot, which isn't because I want to, it's because there's like rules that I don't even necessarily agree with, although I don't really know what the better alternative is. But just having this like really authentic sort of meta conversation about suicide and death and all of that, I found especially with teens are unique in that they have really strong bullshit detectors. So I think it's more helpful for them when someone is kind of leveling with them.
Yes.
But I do think that it also sort of hastened the rapport building process. And they were like, oh, this is like the only person in the system who isn't bullshitting me and isn't just going down a checklist. And they're just saying, and they're actually saying that I can kill myself if I want to. And none of them ever did kill themselves. So, I mean, looking back, I almost think starting with this almost existential and slightly irreverent mode, saying, let's just put it on the table, actually started the conversation in a healthier way, and then followed by, as we did build a rapport, and if we did talk about suicide, me just saying authentically, like, I would personally, like, I would be very much negatively impacted if you killed yourself, just because I care about you. And again, it's not because I don't care what the legal or ethical piece is. Like, I would miss you because I think you're a cool person, and I think that, that means something as well once you actually have the relationship, for someone to say like, oh, well, this person cares about me, so they don't want me to kill myself. It's just, it's different. It's different than that mechanical checklist in the method that you were speaking of.
Well, and I think it's so striking, even when you say, I feel afraid, even verbalizing it out loud, like how we've become so afraid to speak about suicide in certain ways, right? Like that we've inherited this view that there's only one way to speak about it. And it must mean that we're, always kind of controlling it and containing it. But to be open to learning about another's despair doesn't mean we're condoning that they go off and kill themselves. And presumably by coming to see you for help, there's still a part of them that's curious about whether that's an option that they want to pursue or not, and whether life is worth living. And then to say, well, I'm a person you can have that conversation with. I can. Yeah. And it's also true that people have killed themselves throughout human history. People have killed themselves in hospital settings, where in maximum security kind of context. So it is true to a point that we can't control people. I guess we could lock everybody up and say that's suicide prevention, but most of us would have an ethical problem with that, right? Like we would say, we'll bring the rates down to zero, but we would be ethically concerned about that as an intervention. So I think it is important to also make the distinction between being responsible for providing quality care to someone and being responsible for another person's life. And I think that that's an important distinction here as well. Because sometimes I think we mistakenly think I'm the one that needs to keep you alive. And I think we are responsible for creating a possibility for someone to explore those questions and to provide the best quality care that we can. And in cases where it does seem like there's an imminent suicide and that we might need to invoke those kinds of emergency responses, I think in the rare case, those are things that we could agree it's probably worthwhile. But for the large majority of cases, I think it is hanging in there with that conversation and not letting your own anxiety get the better of you, so that you then now are not being helpful anymore.
That's right, because then you're thinking only of yourself and you left the person and abandoned them. I have a colleague who's a psychiatrist, and he used to work with, be a forensic psychiatrist working with recently released offenders. And when he was in his office once, a patient came in and pointed a gun at him. And his first thought was, oh shit, I'm going to die. Mm-hmm. But then he said to the guy, you must be feeling really vulnerable to take that out. How are you feeling? And they started talking, and the guy put the gun away, and they had a session. Because he stopped thinking, oh my God, what about me? And he went out to this troubled person and helped him. And that was an extreme example, but if what we're trained to do is protect ourselves and our license above all and above any question, then we abandon the client in trouble.
That's right.
We don't listen anymore.
And I think that was another thing that came out of our findings in this small qualitative study, is that sometimes those protocols and requirements center the interests of the organization and the practitioner over the client. And I don't think that that's what they're meant to do. I think that they're hopefully they're as loose guides that can be helpful to people as they're thinking about engaging with people who are thinking about suicide. But yes, this tick box mentality, I think, is antithetical to the kind of helping that we're talking about.
Yeah, I think so too, because one of the reasons, first of all, suicide is very self-centered. All real depression is very self-centered. And sometimes I say, you're a political person, isn't there someone else you think is more worthy of being dead than you? They laugh. And they, because a lot of people who come to see me have professed left politics. And so, of course, their hit list would be much bigger than themselves, who are very much an activist. But it makes them giggle because they're aware then of the self-centeredness of taking your own life rather than saying my life could be worth something. Look at these other lives that I condemn. Why am I taking mine?
I like the sort of disruptive irreverence of it, just from I don't know, because I have DBT brain a lot, so I like the way that it just probably really disrupts the cognitive process or whatever there.
It does. They giggle.
But I wanted, so it's a zooming out again, kind of, because what you've touched on, Jennifer, is this, so there's protecting, well, you both said now, there's protecting the individual clinician, and then there's protecting an organization if you're in a sort of clinic or hospital or whatever. But I also wonder just culturally, our views of death, how that maybe impacts our views, because you could call it countertransference from a therapist side. of like, oh no, death, suicide, there's blood and guts or something, or what, I don't know, whatever if you have a trauma history that has to do either with suicidality or with just death, people dying or whatever. But like, what, if we could look at two totally separate cultures, I've never looked at studies on this, but like, say in the Western, like, if we just think of the way we treat death generally, like in the West, where like someone dies and then you like call the emergency people, they like drag them, they like cover them up, they drag them somewhere, somebody go like fills them full of chemicals, and then you do this like funeral thing, and it's like fake, and then everyone dresses up, and then but they never talk to each other normally, and then they like avoid each other after, and they cry and they get drunk, and then they like go home and they're like traumatized or whatever. Where there's like cultures where it's like everyone hangs out with the body and like talks, there's a sort of spiritual thing, and then you go and you actually bury the body together, or you do whatever you do. And there's, so what would be our response in a professional clinical realm if we had just a different, I think, cultural relationship to death generally, like as just whether it's suicide or just death, right? Like someone dying, like they can die from anything, but suicide's just another way of dying, right? We might attribute more meaning to it as it's like more dark because it's like the person they like murdered themselves or something, right? Or you could just view it as, I don't know, something else. They were trying to alleviate a level of suffering that there was no other option available to them. But if you just had a more maybe desensitized or accepting view of death, I wonder if we would just if we would have less anxiety when it comes into the room. Does that make sense? Or have you studied that at all, Jennifer?
Well, I haven't. No, I have not studied that specifically, but I know that there's a lot of really interesting work in the area of suicide bereavement that kind of resonates with what you're saying, which is grief psychology is also tending to be drawing from a very individualizing, pathologizing framework, where often the frame is, you need to get over it, you need to let go of the person who's died, and you need to move on. And I think there's other ways of thinking about bereavement that enable one to stay connected to the person who's died. So again, a more relational possibility that isn't about severing ties, but staying connected. And there's lots of ways that people do this in the kind of grief work that they're doing, where they're trying to honor the person who's died, even if it's by suicide. So not seeing them as only their suicidal act, but they're more than that. So there's that piece of it. But I also think what you're pointing to is there's so many different ways we can make meaning of suicide and death. And already we have categories like medically assisted dying or medically assisted suicide or euthanasia that people seem to feel less queasy about than suicide, right? So we already have categories that we put frameworks around, and that we say, well, in this case, we can justify it because someone's at the end of their life or they're experiencing tremendous suffering. And so we don't feel as many ethical qualms about them taking their own life. And so I think these point to the diversity of ways that we think about death and the ways that we shape meaning through, how we talk about them. And I think we need to have more descriptions available to us for thinking about suicide and death in general. That isn't just necessarily this kind of Western notion, as you say, kind of we're disconnected from death in many ways. And don't necessarily see it as, a part of life, because it is. I mean, death is a part of life,
right?
A vital part.
Death and taxes, right?
Yes,
it's death and taxes, the two inevitable, the only sure things that are to happen.
Yeah, but I guess people think they can evade both.
Yeah.
More successful on the tax angle.
Offshore accounts and immortality. Yeah.
Yeah, the Trump syndrome. But there is a way that Americans are afraid of all their physical processes and hide them away, our ties to nature. There's children. There's a Inuit children's book called Annie, and the old one about a little girl who loves her grandmother. And what the last thing that women do in the Inuit culture is they weave a tapestry, and when it's done, they know they're gone. They're done and they're ready to die if they're very old and they feel it's time. They go out to an ice floe and lie down and die. And so this little girl who wanted her grandma to stay undid the weaving at night at least part of it so her grandmother would stay alive. And her grandmother says, no, I have lived and this is my goodbye and I need to have this right. I need to be able to go when I'm ready. Don't try to change this. This is part of me and this is part of the world. And the little girl accepts it. So it's a whole different approach.
And staying connected with one's ancestors is a big part of that cultural tradition where those relationships might not be physically present anymore, but strong spiritually, still connected to those who've gone before.
And emotionally, we all, if I have found in myself and in my clients, because I'm old enough that all my friends have dead parents, and I found that you miss the parent only if the person you were in that parent's eyes is something you want to keep. If the person that you were in their eyes is something you don't like, then you don't miss them at all. It's just a relief. There's a huge change of meaning depending on the uniqueness of who you are in the eyes of the person who died. And so the death is so different depending on who died and what was the relationship.
So Jennifer, when we talk about, well, here's I'm going to turn you into my therapist for a quick second. So I feel trapped sometimes. You're going to have to help me out of this. I feel trapped in that, whether as a clinician or maybe an activist or whatever, looking at something like suicide and I guess, well, what I'm saying is trapped in the symptom mentality. Here's what I mean. When we can zoom out and say, well, it's people's low wages, or it's the history of colonialism, and we can really start to look at this sort of socio-political factors. But since in the mental health field, social workers can play a macro role, but typically in the more psychotherapy, mental health professional world, even if we conceptualize something like suicide as a sociological phenomenon that needs sociological conceptualization, I feel trapped sometimes in that, how am I supposed to actually treat, quote unquote, treat? Maybe that's just the framework is wrong, right? But how am I supposed to treat the suicidality if the whole thing of what I do is I provide this like one-on-one service where I listen to people talk, and that can't change their wages. It can't change their housing security. It can't change, the conditions of like a native reservation or of like federal policy about things, or like the criminal justice system, like or immigration systems. It's like taking, ripping families apart or whatever, or like gun laws, right? And so hopefully that makes sense. And feeling trapped sometimes, and I'm like, well, I can kind of do all this activism on the side, but I can't really do it professionally. I can't do it in the room necessarily. Like I can maybe help this individual conceptualize things maybe as I do in a zoom out view, but that doesn't change the condition, the situational conditions. So I don't mean to like impose like despair and hopelessness, but does that resonate? And do you within the Critical Suicidology Network, since it seems like that you all are definitely pushing the boundaries of trying to reconceptualize things like suicide into a broader view, what's sort of the I guess what would the newer treatment model look like that's not so medicalized and individualized?
Well, when you frame that, it's very important to understand that we can't change the social conditions, but we can empower our clients to see them and feel that they have agency in changing the social conditions that oppress them, as well as the political conditions that oppress them. It's an empowerment, it's a liberation, which we won't do ourselves, but we can communicate to our clients a sense of agency and hope that activates them on their own behalf.
Well, and I think I agree. And I think just to add to that is I think there's still a need for people to receive compassionate, caring responses that support people who are suffering. I'm not saying that that's no longer relevant. But what I think we can do is in the way that we craft our questions, we help people to see that sometimes the things that they feel like failures about, or that they're not living up to the normative view of what counts as mental health, is actually situated in a broad context that values certain lives over others and makes it difficult for them to get ahead, for example, because of structural racism or because of colonial histories. And so building a conversation that helps them to see themselves situated differently in relationship to the problem is a powerful intervention. And they can also be helped to create lines of connection with other people, building community so that they're not so isolated. And I think, again, coming back to narrative therapy practices that are really very rooted in a post-structural kind of theoretical analysis, and it's very explicitly political work, is it really challenges these kind of narrow notions of mental health and helps people to take, up a different position in relation to some of these normative frameworks, so that they can see their suicide in some ways as a protest or as a spirited refusal, as some have put it, to live in these times, but that they no longer feel like that's a blame the victim kind of a situation, which some of our approaches do tend to do, locate the problems in persons by suggesting they're the ones that have to make all the changes. And so it's a shift in how the problem is framed, and then what you can build out from that, as Harriet says, is helping people make links to broader social movements so that they then are no longer isolated themselves as being so-called the problem.
Yeah.
And in Indigenous communities, we see a lot of this in terms of efforts towards resurgence and sovereignty and working together as a community. That doesn't mean that some people don't experience what we might call feelings of hopelessness and depression, but the coming together as a community to stand up for something that they believe in is a suicide prevention move, in my view.
It is.
Right. Agreed. Yeah. Well, thank you for
like joining a union is, in a sense.
Right.
You join with other people, you get a sense of collectivity. And really, I believe that the basis of mental health is connection. And you create connection as an antidote to death, which is very important.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Creating community and connection and relational possibilities with others, whether they're still alive or no longer here, I think are all possibilities for.
And with you too, and a connection with you as well.
Yeah.
And solidarity, I think like the term gets thrown around a lot in like left kind of activist circles, but I don't think, the last episode we did with a couple of labor organizers, they were saying that, at least in the US, like workers generally don't really know what solidarity feels like viscerally. They don't, just because the union movement has been kind of like, it's been on like life support for like 50 years in the US, that it's really hard for like workers to understand your coworkers aren't just out to get you and aren't just trying to snitch on you to HR and aren't trying to like climb over you for a promotion. Yeah, your coworkers are willing to actually take action to make sure that the boss stops harassing you or that we can get a little bit more, benefits or wages or whatever. That in the US, that's just not it's not a cultural norm for workers to say like, yeah, my coworkers have my back. We're in solidarity. We're in a shared struggle, which we can actually overcome if and only if we see each other as equals and if we work together to overcome. And that actually makes me kind of wonder that the word solidarity, because I wanted to ask you earlier too, that the sort of racial and gender disparities, and again, I don't know if they're the same from Canada to the US. I'm sure there's some similarities, but from what I recall, from what I've read, rates of suicide, so suicide attempts, I think, from women tend to be higher. Suicide completions are much higher for men. And that tends to be, as you said, correlated with access to firearms. Typically, maybe there's other factors there. But then there's also, when you look at rates across sort of ethnic and racial grouping, that I believe white males in the U.S. Well, there's this interesting. I don't think anyone's ever quite figured this out, but like white men have the highest and black women have the lowest suicide completion rates in the U.S. But I think that white men and Native American men in the U.S. are relatively similar. And I've just always wondered. I mean, because I feel like you can only kind of speculate. And like my thing has been, well, white men have been taught for generations to be as anti-solidarity as you can possibly be. Like that's just what our identities are built on, is like anti-solidarity. Black women I don't know. I mean, if I could see there being a longer history of like, well, we have to have solidarity, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Native American men, I don't quite know. I mean, I would imagine that there's just more sort of intergenerational despair or something, but I don't know. I'm just speculating. I mean, have you looked at those kinds of disparities and have any sort of thoughts or theories on those?
Well, I think there's a lot of paradoxes, right? As you say,
Yeah.
there's, high rates of suicide among white men, and that would be a group that we might say has the most privilege. But it's
Right.
also the group who's been led to believe they have the most entitled access to the good life. And so this disconnect between what they've been led to believe is theirs for the taking and it's not becoming available. I think a lot of people, who've done much more scholarly work on this. I mean, I'm just scratching a surface of an impression I'm building. So I think that's an important thing to look at. And I think, as you say, the gender paradox is that many women experience much higher rates of depression and they engage in non-fatal suicidal behaviors. So what's that about, and what's the difference there? And I think, again, sometimes we fall into the trap of creating these binaries between saying men are more serious or they're really going to get the job done and women are, just gesturing or attention seeking. And that's problematic in its own way. So I think we have to be careful about not, framing certain things as more serious or more certain or I think there's been a lot of work that's done gender analyses of how we even think about suicide, and how they get framed up as suicidal gestures as somehow not as important, and yet it's still an expression of distress, and it's still something I think we need to figure into our efforts to not just think about suicide rates or deaths by suicide, but also the number of people engaging in suicidal behavior. And I think too of the LGBTQ community who has quite high rates of suicidal behaviors. And again, that's another example of the need to think about that in the context of the times of heteronormativity and transphobia and transmisogyny. And these are ways that we've communicated to certain groups that your life is not worth living. And I think that's the shift we need to make.
Now, I also think if mental health is based around connection and emotional connection with other people as well as solidarity, white men have the least of that in the United States, where they farmed out their emotional connection to women by and large, and women no longer accept the burden and leave. Women are 70% of the divorce initiators in this country. And so that men don't have those emotional skills, and they've been deprived of them in childhood, where it's not manly to cry or hold hands with another boy or hug or do a whole bunch of other things that women are allowed to do to connect with their friends, with each other, with their children, with relatives. And so that I think the lack of connection is so unhealthy mentally. And that's why that's another reason, in addition to the proximity of guns and gun culture, that they would be more vulnerable to suicide.
Well, and I think you bring up this important point about really narrow notions of masculinity, and that patriarchy doesn't serve a lot of men well either. I think all of these things have limited the ways that men, as you say, can express the need to get help or how that help needs to look. We put a lot of value on talking it out, which might not necessarily be what men would find most helpful when in despair. So yeah, there's a lot of analysis that needs to be done there.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, for a lot of men, the connection, what makes it less shameful to have emotional need is you show it only in connection of sexual connection, only with your sex partner. And somehow it's more allowable. So if you don't have that kind of deep relationship with a sex partner, you don't have that emotional release either.
Yeah. And I do think, well, and then zooming out kind of further, this is where sometimes it's just so big, and it's like it's stuff that I've learned mainly from you, Harriet, but just the shifts in, we'll throw around the term neoliberalism for this, but in more to be more specific, it's like in as jobs became more within like sort of let's say the imperial core in the U.S., the deindustrialization processes of like the majority of say factory jobs and manufacturing, just anything that was like hands-on physical labor began to be more outsourced, and then this sort of like global capital phenomenon just sort of took on this monstrous size that disconnection, the economic glue that held primarily, I guess, white families, but just the economic glue that held people together to have like economic stability, as that began to fall apart more and more for those who sort of were given the sort of economic privilege pedestal, as that started falling apart. And as you say, also, I think the women's movement did kind of succeed in at least getting, at least like, corporate feminism has done pretty well. Like women do have like a ladder toward better economic standards on average, a lot better than 50 years ago, even though it's not totally, and especially white women, it's not totally equal. But yeah, so those are some of those larger factors that, again, it would seem, I think, if you're in the room and you're doing a suicide assessment or something with someone, you're not going to bring up to like the older white guy, well, you know about neoliberalism, right, man? Like, you know about deindustrialization. You know how like your dad worked in a union job and then he didn't, and then your pension was lost and now you're screwed. Well, that's why you want to kill yourself. Like, you wouldn't say that, but that actually is a factor. Like, that's a huge factor, just the actual economic changes over the last like half century. And and this is, again, I shouldn't say trapped. I'm not actually hopeless. I just feel sometimes frustrated because I don't see a clinical solution. But once we understand these broader, the really big like global factors on that scale, right? Like the way like global capital has like transformed in the last 50 years, and we say like, wow, so that has impacts on suicide rates and like gender and racial disparities of suicide rates. Like, to me, I go like, well, geez, why are we just talking about symptoms? Like, that seems so silly, right?
Of course it does. I just wanted to say that I've had several older male clients, guys 50 and up, to whom I've explained what's happened in the economy, who are so relieved it's not their fault. They're not losers. And they're, and they do have merit. And they're because a lot of suicide is also shame and punishment. And so that if people feel like they are the victims of an impersonal economic change based on capitalist profit, they don't have to feel like, oh my God, I thought I was a failure. And that changes a lot in terms of depression and suicidality. So it's not just that they heard some abstract lecture, but they see how it impacts their life, and that it wasn't their fault is huge.
Yeah. Well, we're about at an hour. Jennifer, do you have any kind of final? We're going to put some links in the show description, but do you have any, whether it's like websites, articles, things that you could kind of plug for listeners to understand your work better, or just some of the general concepts and ideas that you've been working on for the last several years?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks for this conversation. It's been really rich, and I've enjoyed very much listening to you and learning alongside you as we think together about all these complexities, but also the possibilities for doing things differently. And I think there's a tide that's shifting towards people saying, yeah, we need to do something different, because what we've been doing for a very long time isn't sort of achieving what we thought we would. Right. But there has been a recent book that I'll just mention the name if people want to follow up. It's an edited collection called Suicide and Social Justice: New Perspectives on the Politics of Suicide and Suicide Prevention. And it was edited by Mark Button and Ian Marsh. And I think it came out 2019, I believe. I can send you the link. But it actually is a series of chapters. I've got a chapter in at the end there on the vision of a more collective ethics, that we have to take a kind of collective accountability to create worlds worth living in. And it's a little bit different from saying creating a life worth living in, because that, again, again individualizes that. But this creating worlds that all have the possibility for flourishing, right? And so that's a collective project. And it's a stepping toward this future that we all have a stake in, and that we're all in some ways not equally complicit, but complicit. And there's no innocent place to stand. And that's sort of the theme of that article or that chapter in that book that I write about, is that we have some work to do, and that we need to contain and maintain a critical perspective on our own work in critical suicide studies, so that we don't become complacent or think that we've now solved this problem, because clearly that's not the case. And I think it's important to have a pluralistic approach that allows for multiple approaches and paradigms to flourish.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm going to check out that book. That sounds great, and it was a huge honor to have you. This was a really invigorating, enlivening discussion for me. So I enjoyed it a lot.
Me too.
By the way, listeners, if you have enjoyed anything you've heard Harriet say in this program, you will definitely enjoy Capitalism Hits Home, which is a solo program that Harriet does through Democracy at Work, which is a worker-owned cooperative that produces other great programs such as Economic Update with Richard Wolff and the Anti-Capitalist Chronicles with David Harvey. I can't recommend enough that everyone also listen to Capitalism Hits Home if you enjoy It's Not Just in Your Head.
Capitalism Hits Home is a sort of broader overhead view. It explores the way that capitalism shapes our personal lives, our psyches, our relationships, our families, and it looks particularly at the sea change in American personal life, as all Americans, but the top 10 or 20% of Americans, have our security and our chance for a future become as precarious as it always was for minorities and families headed by women. It's not just in your head, and Capitalism Hits Home are definitely complementary.
And if listeners would like to check out Capitalism Hits Home, Harriet, where should they go to find it?
Either on YouTube or Democracy at Work, or on my own website, harrietfraud.com.